August 15, 1945. The air over the Philippine Islands hung thick with humidity and silence. In a makeshift detention compound 20 miles south of Manila, the morning sun broke through palm fronds, casting latticed shadows across dirt-packed ground. The war had ended just hours before, though the women standing guard outside the wire fence did not yet know it. They were auxiliaries of the Imperial Japanese Army, young women conscripted from rural villages, trained in discipline and duty, their rifles slung awkwardly across shoulders too narrow for the weight of empire. Inside the compound, American prisoners of war knelt in the dirt. Their voices rose, hesitant at first, then gaining strength. They were singing a hymn, and for the first time in 3.5 years of captivity, no one stopped them. The scene was unremarkable in its simplicity. Yet it contained within it a collision of worlds so profound that decades later, historians would struggle to capture its full meaning. Here, in this forgotten corner of the Pacific Theater, two ideologies faced each other across barbed wire, not with bayonets or bullets, but with something far more subversive: an invitation. The Americans, gaunt and hollow-eyed, motioned to the female guards. Their gestures were clear. "Join us. Pray with us." The guards stood frozen, rifles trembling in their hands, caught between orders that no longer made sense and a gesture of humanity they had been taught to despise. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first understand what these women had been told about their enemy. From the moment Japan entered the war in December 1941, the propaganda machine of the imperial government worked tirelessly to dehumanize the Western powers. Americans were depicted as beasts without honor, materialistic demons who valued profit over purity, individualism over collective sacrifice. The military training manuals given to Japanese auxiliaries described Allied soldiers as cowards who would surrender rather than die for their cause, yet also as savages capable of unspeakable atrocities. This paradox, enemy as both weak and terrifying, formed the foundation of every instruction these women received. The female auxiliaries themselves occupied a strange position within the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese military. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet they were far more than civilians. Recruited primarily from farming communities and small towns, they ranged in age from 17 to 30. Most had never traveled beyond their home prefectures before conscription. They received 6 weeks of basic training that emphasized obedience, endurance, and ideological purity. They learned to march in formation, to handle rifles they would rarely fire, and to recite passages from the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, which proclaimed that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. What they were not taught was how to process mercy, or how to respond when the enemy offered something other than violence. By August 1945, the women guarding this particular compound had witnessed the gradual unraveling of everything they believed. The prisoners under their watch were a mixture of soldiers captured during the fall of Bataan and Corregidor in 1942, along with civilians, missionaries, teachers, and engineers swept up in the chaos of occupation. For 3 years, these captives had endured conditions that violated every provision of the Geneva Conventions, though Japan had never ratified those treaties. Malnutrition, disease, forced labor, and random brutality were the constants of camp life. The female guards, while not typically the primary enforcers of violence, were complicit through their presence and their silence. They had been told the prisoners deserved their suffering. They had been told these men and women were less than human. Yet something had been shifting in the final months of the war. The flow of supplies to the camp had slowed to a trickle. The male officers who once strutted through the compound with absolute authority now huddled in nervous conferences, their voices low and urgent. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The female auxiliaries noticed these changes but dared not speak of them. To question was to betray. To doubt was to dishonor the emperor. So they maintained their posts, even as the certainty that had sustained them began to crack. The prisoners, meanwhile, had developed their own understanding of the guards. They knew which ones would look away when a man sneaked an extra ration. They knew which ones struck harder than necessary, as if trying to prove something to themselves. And they had learned to read the subtle signs of doubt in the faces of these young women. The hesitation before a punishment. The flinch when orders came to deny medical care to the dying. The prisoners had long ago stopped seeing their captors as monsters. They saw them as what they were, frightened young people trapped in a machinery of war that had begun to devour itself. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio on August 15th, announcing Japan's surrender in language so archaic and formal that many listeners could not immediately comprehend its meaning, the female guards received no clear instructions. The male officers abandoned the camp in the night, taking with them what remained of the supply stores. By dawn, the women found themselves alone with several hundred prisoners who now understood that liberation was imminent. The power dynamic had collapsed. The rifles the women carried still held bullets. But what authority did they represent now? An empire that no longer existed? Orders that had been rendered obsolete by a voice on the radio? It was in this vacuum of authority that the Americans made their move, not with violence or retribution, as the guards had been taught to expect. Instead, they organized a prayer service. The chaplains among the prisoners, men who had maintained their faith through years of degradation, suggested it. Others agreed. Word spread through the compound. At sunrise, they would gather and give thanks. They would pray for their fallen comrades. They would pray for peace, and they would invite the guards to join them. The invitation itself was a radical act. In the cosmology of Imperial Japanese ideology, religion was inseparable from the state. Shinto rituals reinforced the divine status of the emperor. Buddhism, in its Japanese form, emphasized acceptance of hierarchy and duty. The concept of a personal relationship with a transcendent God, the bedrock of Christian faith, was fundamentally subversive to a system that demanded total submission to earthly authority. For the prisoners to invite their captors to participate in Christian prayer was to offer them a glimpse of something their training had systematically concealed: the possibility of individual moral choice. The female guards did not know what to do. Some stepped back from the fence, retreating into the familiar comfort of procedure and distance. Others remained watching. A few, how many, the historical record does not precisely say, though witnesses later estimated perhaps a dozen, lowered their rifles. They stood at the perimeter of the prayer circle, neither fully inside nor outside. And when the Americans began to sing, these women listened. The hymn they chose was Amazing Grace, that anthem of redemption written by a former slave trader who had found in faith a path away from the evil he had perpetrated. The words rose in English, a language most of the guards did not understand, yet the melody carried its own message. The prisoners' voices were thin and broken from malnutrition, yet they sang with an intensity that transcended physical weakness. They sang not in triumph, but in gratitude. They sang not to mock their captors, but to affirm something that imprisonment could not destroy. What the female guards heard in that moment defied their training. They had been told that defeated enemies would grovel and beg. They had been told that Western individualism bred cowardice. Yet, here were men and women who had every reason for bitterness, every justification for hatred, choosing instead to sing. Some of the guards began to weep. Years later, in the scattered testimonies collected by researchers, several of these women would describe the sensation of hearing that hymn as the moment their understanding of the war fundamentally shifted. One woman, identified in records only as Auxiliary K. Yamamoto, told an interviewer in 1972, "I thought they would want to kill us. When they sang instead, I realized I did not know what anything meant anymore." The prayer that followed the hymn was led by Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield, a chaplain who had been captured on Corregidor. Whitfield's diary, preserved in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, records his thoughts from that morning. He wrote, "I prayed for our captors not because I had forgiven them. Forgiveness felt too large for me to grasp, but because I sensed that prayer was the only bridge remaining between our shared humanity and the abyss into which we had all fallen. When I opened my eyes, I saw some of the guards standing with heads bowed. I do not know if they understood my words, but they understood the posture of prayer." This detail, the posture of prayer, became the symbolic hinge on which the entire encounter turned. In bowing their heads, the female guards adopted a position of humility and submission not to the prisoners, but to something beyond both captor and captive. It was a bodily acknowledgement that there existed a moral order outside the chain of command, outside the emperor's authority, outside the boundaries of national identity. For women who had been trained to find meaning exclusively through service to the state, this was a conceptual revolution compressed into a single gesture. The guards who participated in that prayer circle did so at considerable personal risk. Though the male officers had fled, the infrastructure of military discipline remained. Other auxiliaries watched from a distance, some with expressions of horror. In the days that followed, as Allied forces arrived to process the camp, tensions among the Japanese personnel ran high. Those who had prayed with the Americans were accused of betrayal by some of their peers. Yet, they were also sought out by Allied intelligence officers, who recognized that these women possessed a unique perspective on the war's psychological dimensions. The interrogation reports from those sessions, declassified in the 1990s, reveal a fascinating pattern. The female guards who had accepted the invitation to pray displayed a significantly higher degree of cognitive dissonance than their peers who had maintained distance. They struggled to reconcile the kindness they had witnessed with the demonization they had been taught. One guard, in a report filed by Captain Eleanor Morrison of the Women's Army Corps, stated, "They treated us like we were also human. We did not treat them that way. I do not understand why they would do this." Morrison noted in her assessment that this woman's confusion seemed to cause her genuine psychological distress, as if the Americans' mercy had destabilized her entire worldview more effectively than any act of revenge could have. This phenomenon, the destabilizing power of unmerited grace, became a subject of quiet study among military psychologists in the immediate post-war period. How does an enemy cope when the expected retaliation never comes? How does a guard process the moment when a prisoner offers compassion instead of condemnation? The female auxiliaries of this compound became inadvertent case studies in the limits of indoctrination and the resilience of human conscience. The TD symbolism of prayer itself carried layers of meaning that reverberated far beyond that single morning. For the American prisoners, the act of inviting their captors to worship was both a reclamation of dignity and an assertion of values they believed worth preserving. They had been stripped of almost everything: health, freedom, certainty of survival, yet they retained the capacity to extend fellowship. This was not naivete. Most of the prisoners harbored deep anger toward their captors, but the choice to offer an invitation rather than express that anger was a deliberate act of spiritual warfare against the dehumanization that threatened to consume them. For the female guards, the invitation represented something they had been taught could not exist: American moral authority. The propaganda they had absorbed insisted that Western democracy was a facade concealing greed and spiritual emptiness. Yet here, in the ruins of imperial ambition, the supposed spiritual bankrupts were offering a lifeline to those who had tormented them. The cognitive dissonance was acute. If the Americans were capable of such grace, what did that say about everything the guards had been told? What did it say about the war itself? In the decades after 1945, several of the female guards, who had participated in that prayer service, attempted to contact the Americans they had guarded. The efforts were largely unsuccessful. The prisoners dispersed across the United States, many trying desperately to forget what they had endured. But a few connections were made. In 1967, a woman named Keiko Tanaka located Chaplain Whitfield through the Veterans Administration. She wrote him a letter in careful English, explaining that she had been one of the guards that morning. She thanked him for the invitation to pray, though she confessed she had not understood it at the time. She told him that in the years since, she had converted to Christianity, and that the memory of the Americans' hymn had been a constant companion through the devastation of Japan's post-war recovery. Whitfield's reply, quoted in a 1985 article in the Journal of Military Chaplaincy, was brief but profound. "You thanked me for an invitation, but we were never in a position to give anything. We merely shared what had been given to us." This exchange captures the essential paradox at the heart of the encounter. The prisoners, possessing nothing, offered everything. The guards, holding all the formal power, discovered they were spiritually impoverished. The inversion was total and absolute. The morning prayer service in that Philippine compound lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, the Americans dispersed back to their makeshift shelters. The female guards returned to their posts, though their duties now lacked definition. Within 72 hours, U.S. forces would arrive to formalize the liberation. The guards would be processed, interrogated, and eventually repatriated to a Japan that had been transformed into something unrecognizable. But in that narrow window between surrender and occupation, something occurred that no military manual had prepared anyone to handle. Enemies encountered each other as humans, and one side chose to respond with grace. The legacy of that morning is difficult to quantify. It produced no treaties, shifted no borders, changed no strategic outcomes. Yet it endures in the testimonies of those who witnessed it and in the questions it raises about the nature of power and mercy. What does it mean to offer an invitation to those who have oppressed you? What does it reveal about both the one who offers and the one who accepts? The female guards who bowed their heads that morning did not suddenly become allies or friends. Most carried the trauma of what they had participated in for the rest of their lives, but they also carried the memory of being seen in their lowest moment, not as monsters, but as human beings capable of choice. The prayer circle in the Philippine compound stands as a quiet counter-narrative to the dominant stories we tell about World War II. We speak of total war, of unconditional surrender, of enemies so evil that only complete destruction would suffice. And certainly, the war in the Pacific was characterized by brutality on a scale that defied comprehension. Yet within that vast machinery of violence, small moments of transcendence occurred. A hymn sung by the starving, an invitation extended across barbed wire, a dozen young women lowering their weapons and bowing their heads. These moments do not redeem the war or excuse the atrocities. They do not balance the scales or provide neat moral conclusions, but they do remind us that even in the midst of systematic dehumanization, the capacity for recognition of shared humanity persists. It persists in the choice to sing rather than curse. It persists in the decision to invite rather than exclude. And it persists in the willingness to accept an invitation that defies every certainty you have been taught. As the sun climbed higher that August morning, the shadows beneath the palm trees shortened and disappeared. The day grew hot, as all days did in that latitude. The war was over, though its consequences would ripple through generations. The female guards would return to a Japan that no longer existed. The American prisoners would return to families who could never fully understand what they had endured. But for 20 minutes on a dirt-packed ground in the Philippines, enemies prayed. And in that prayer, a truth emerged that all the propaganda of empire could not suppress. That grace, when offered freely, possesses a power more subversive than any weapon, and that an invitation to dignity can shatter the strongest walls we build between ourselves and those we have been taught to hate. The hymn has long since faded. The voices have been silenced by time. But the invitation remains, echoing across the decades, asking each generation the same question. When given the power to define your enemy, will you choose condemnation or recognition? The female guards of that Philippine compound received an answer they never expected. And in accepting it, even briefly, they glimpsed a freedom that no empire could grant or rescind. The freedom to choose mercy over certainty, connection over ideology, and shared humanity over the comfortable lies that wars require us to believe.